Thanks, man. It's kind. Thank you. Thank you very much, Randy. You know, it is really strange to think that I've known Randy only 4 years, and I do kid him, because honestly, he's one of my top best friends, but I feel like everybody that knows him feels like he's their best friend. You know, he's just got that empathic kind of personality that really connects with people instantly. I'm painfully aware that I'm in a suit. And this is not how I imagined it. Over the weekend, I went to Urban Outfitters, and I walked in, and this kid says to me, can I help you? And I said, yeah, I'm looking for some skinny jeans and maybe a hoodie and maybe some old-style sneakers. And he kind of looked at me with this kind of smug look, and he said, for a gift? And I said, no, for me. And he said, dude, I'm going to have to card you. And I said, you're kidding me. I was incredulous. And so I pulled out my driver's license, and he said, I'm sorry, I can't sell you anything. You're too old. And I said, are you kidding me? And he said, no, we don't sell to people unless they're over or under 30. And I said, wow. And I was really disappointed because I knew I was going to be with you guys. And I said, are there any exceptions, anything I can do? And he said, well, there is one exception. He said, if you're a worship leader, and, sorry. By the way, I have one of my daughters who's 22 years old said, Dad, how many hipsters does it take to change a light bulb? Have you heard this? And I said, I don't know. And she says, you've probably never really heard of it. It's an obscure number. Yeah, she had to explain it to me. I didn't really get it either, but. Well, who am I? I thought I'd do a little bit of a formal intro in the Ken Davis tradition. By the way, Randy's exactly right. I know Randy and Patsy and Ken on a personal basis, and we just have such a great time together in conversations and eating together and just sharing one another's lives. And so I'm a little bit astounded when I hear them in front of a group and I forget these are extraordinarily talented people. And the messages, well, starting with Patsy, but then Randy yesterday and Ken, I mean, didn't they kill it? It was so powerful. Yeah. I'm just so honored to call them my friends. Well, this is why I'm not a hipster. I was born on June the 25th, 1955, which makes me exactly 55 years old. My family is really important to me, especially my dear wife, Gail. I actually met her at a college dinner at Baylor University, and I had sworn off dating completely. I just decided I wanted to be serious about my relationship with Christ and really grow spiritually and not be distracted by all these beautiful women on campus until I met her. And I'm not kidding. 45 seconds after I met her, I knew this was the future Mrs. Hyatt. It took her about a year to come to the same conclusion. But we've been married now for 32 years, and she puts up with a lot. For example, this morning, I'm having breakfast with Dan Cathy at Merity's, and I told Gail as I'm running out the door, I said, honey, I'll come back and pick you up at 8:30, and then we'll go over to the venue, because we want to be in one car together, because we have to leave here to go to a Women of Faith event, which our company, it's a ministry of Thomas Nelson. So I'm sitting here at about 9 o'clock, and I text her, and I said, are you coming? She said, well, you were supposed to pick me up at 8:30. I said, oh, yeah, so I forgot. Together, we have 5 daughters. I couldn't make this up. My little brother has 5 sons. So it's almost like before we started having kids, we divided the chromosomes, and I decided I would have the women. But as a result of that, and you'll just have to factor this into my presentation, I do suffer from estrogen poisoning. And there's actually 3 ways to know that you have this particular ailment. Okay, so here's how to know if you suffer from estrogen poisoning. If you can watch Extreme Makeover Home Edition and cry like a baby, that's a clue. If you can listen to a female in your life, a daughter, a spouse, a staff member, tell you about some problem they're having, and listen intently for an hour without offering to fix it or solve the problem, that's a clue. And if you know the answer, the correct answer to the question, does this make my butt look fat? That's also a clue. I actually used this at a seminary recently, and some of the female staff members were offended, so I hope that's not offensive, because I mean, I'm surrounded by women. I love women. I think they add so much to my life, and I hope that I add something to theirs. But I also have 3 son-in-laws, thankfully. And I'll tell you, this has been one of the great joys of my life, is to hang out with these guys. And you got to meet one of them, the one on the far right, Joel Miller, also works at Thomas Nelson and is a writer, and is one of the guys that was interviewed on the author panel the other day. And then I also have these 4 precious grandchildren. Ken talked about his yesterday, and these really are the love of my life. I wish I could have gone straight to grandchildren without the challenge of having kids, because that about killed me. But this is the reward when you get to this. And on October the 1st, my second daughter, Mindy, had a little baby boy named Ben. And I just threw this in here last night because Ken showed this little video, and I thought, okay, us grandpas got to stick together. I got to show this video of Ben. So that's him.
Ben is 4 months old. Yesterday. Hi. Oh, you gonna fuss? You gonna fuss a little bit? Boo.
So he's awesome. Awesome. He just has those kind of cheeks, you know, that you want to grab and kiss. They just demand to be kissed. I am the chairman and CEO of Thomas Nelson, where I've been in that position for about 6 years. Our mission is to really inspire the world. And I love this mission because I think the world is desperate for inspiration. And that's what I love about what you do. And that's why I love coming to the Recreate conference, because as somebody who's committed to inspiration, you have to be inspired. And I've left both days here from the Recreate conference tremendously inspired, with my tank full. And you need that, because you can't always be giving and never receiving. And so that's our mission at Thomas Nelson, is to inspire the world. And I have the privilege of working with people like Max Lucado and Don Miller and Andy Stanley and a host of other authors that challenge me and encourage me and keep me fresh. In terms of what I like to do, I really like to read. In fact, being in the publishing business is kind of an occupational hazard for me. I love to blog. And the reason I blog is because I don't really know what I think about something till I've written about it. So it's just a way for me to kind of disentangle my thinking and get clarity in my life about what I believe and what God's called me to do. And as it turns out, I share that with the world and enjoy interacting, because the people that read my blog sharpen my thinking and always add to it. So that's hugely helpful as well. I also haven't run a marathon, but I've run now 5 half marathons, which I didn't start until the age of 50. And one of the things that happened last Friday is I went home and I had a voicemail. And it was HBO. And so I called him back, and they've actually offered me a special. I haven't announced this until this moment, but they've offered me a special on HBO. And we're pretty excited about that. It's $9.99 a month and free installation. So Hopefully we'll have it installed by the weekend. But I wanted to tell you a little bit about my story and turn a little more serious. I wanted to tell you a little bit about my conversion and my experience with Christian creatives, because really for the last 30 years I've been in Christian publishing. I've worked closely with people that are writers. I also spent a brief period of time, about 3 years, managing some Christian artists. So I've lived on that side of the street as well. And I've observed a number of things. But let me just tell you a little bit about my journey. I grew up in a marginally or nominally Christian home, which meant that we went to church on Christmas and Easter until I was in junior high and could make it enough of a fuss that my parents gave up and said, we're not even going to mess with that. After my first semester in college, I was actually a music major, and I was asked to be in a band and to move to Denton, Texas, to this little farmhouse where we were going to rehearse. And, I mean, we had all these delusions of grandeur about how we were going to be rich and famous in this rock band, except that the guys that were in the band, all they wanted to do was to smoke weed. And so they mostly stayed stoned, and I did occasionally too. None of us were Christians. And so the whole thing fell apart in about 6 weeks. Well, it was too late to go back to school. By the way, I should also mention that when I went to my dad about the middle of my freshman, that first semester, and I said, Dad, I've been invited to play in this rock band, and I was scared to death to tell him I wanted to drop out of school. But my dad said to me, he said, I think that's a great idea. Can you imagine that? He said, you're not married, you have no other responsibilities. If it doesn't work out, you can always come back to school. I thought that was enormous wisdom because it kept us connected. And when the band fell apart in about 6 weeks, I was able to come home and everything was fine. So I started selling encyclopedias door to door. This was my first introduction to publishing. And we were traveling throughout Texas and into New Mexico, and we would go into a town like a swarm of locusts, and we would call on everybody there asking them if they wanted to buy encyclopedias. And in New Mexico, I started to notice this strange pattern that people weren't really interested in buying encyclopedias from me. But they wanted to invite me in and tell me about the gospel, which I thought was so weird. They said, well, we're not really interested in your encyclopedias, but if you got a minute, why don't you come in? We'd like to talk to you about something. So after about the third time this happened, I'm scratching my head, waiting to get picked up at the end of the day by my supervisor, and I thought, this is really weird. Because up to this point, I had sort of converted from being an atheist to being an agnostic. And that was a slow conversion because I'd prided myself in being an atheist. But by now I was an agnostic. And I thought, this is really strange. So I got in the car and I started talking to my boss about it. Well, as it turns out, he's a Christian. Now this is 1974. And he says to me, he said, Mike, he said, you've got to read the Bible for yourself. And I just rolled my eyes and I said, oh, I tried that. You know, like when I was 12, I tried to read my dad's Bible. He had this big Masonic Bible, King James Version. And I started reading in the book of Genesis. So when I got to the first round of begats, I bailed out. And I said, I'm really not interested. He said, no, this is different. This is called the Living Bible. And the Living Bible had just been published. And that sounded strange. I didn't know if it was something you had to feed and water or what exactly it was. But as it turned out, we went back to his house, and he handed me a copy of it. This was like 10 o'clock at night. And he said, just try to read it. And I said, well, where do I start? I tried that, you know, the beginning. What's that called? Genesis? Oh, yeah, Genesis. He said, if I were you, I would start in the book of Revelation. Strange advice. But I didn't know any better. So I read the book of Revelation in the Living Bible, and I was totally captivated by the story. It was almost like I was sucked into this epic movie. And I didn't really understand what was going on, but I just thought to myself, I don't think they had drugs back then. So this had to be real. Maybe they did. But this has to be real. And I didn't understand anything until I got to chapter 20, where is the great white throne judgment. And I'd had enough people share the gospel with me that I got that. So I really kind of fell under conviction and started trembling and prayed and invited Jesus into my heart. And didn't really connect it with church initially. Didn't go to church for several months. And a buddy of mine I ran into from high school who was a Christian, who was that nerdy Christian from high school that nobody really wanted to be around. He said, I'd like to tell you about Jesus. And I said, look, I just made that decision. I just invited Jesus into my life. And he kind of looked askance because my life hadn't really changed that much. So one night at my apartment, I'm sitting with all of my best friends. And we're about to go out in the town. And there's a knock at the door. And there is my nerdy friend, Don, with his Southern Baptist pastor. And they want to come in. Okay, so here is my friend and the pastor and all my best friends in the other room. And I'm like in this chasm separating the two. And it seems like the clock stops. And I'm thinking, what am I going to do? You know, it was a little embarrassing, so I invited them in. They came in, sat down with all my best friends. And so the pastor says to me, his name is Robert, he said, Mike, Don told me that you recently accepted Jesus Christ into your life as your Lord and Savior. Tell me about that. This is in front of all my best friends. So I took a deep gulp and began to give my testimony, not knowing that that's what you called it. And most of my best friends, one by one, stood up and walked out of my life forever. And that began a process of discipleship. You know, that pastor met with me. That was in the late spring, and he met with me every day for that next summer to pray with me, to read the Bible, to memorize Scripture. I thought that was normal Christian living, but it was discipleship. And then I got to start working in Christian publishing, and I got to meet some really amazing Christian leaders. But some of those leaders didn't always have a positive impact on me. And I want to talk just a little bit about why I'm here. Because in my working with Christian creatives, I discovered that I am one myself, and that I have a soul and a certain sensitivity. And Randy was talking about being empathic or empathetic yesterday, and it really resonated with me. And I've said to Randy, part of why he connects with people is he is so empathic. And it's really a gift. My oldest daughter has that gift too, and I borrow it a little bit from her. But just to tell you another story that leads into what I want to talk to you about this morning. In the mid-90s, I had the privilege of working with a man, a Christian leader, whose name you would know if I were to mention it, and to protect the guilty, I won't. But he was a dear friend. And he asked me, at that time I was running a literary agency, he asked me to represent him as a literary agent. And this was my dream come true. I had really longed to do this. And then he asked me if I would kind of take the next step up and be an artist manager and really manage his career. And so I said, I don't know much about that, but I'll figure it out. And I was super motivated. And I worked really hard. And we took him out on a tour, and it was like a 30-day tour, and his book ended up on the New York Times list. And I thought, great, now we can leverage this into a big book deal on his behalf. And I was really excited about it. Now, this was in the day of fax machines. I think the only people that still have fax machines are the Amish, but in that day, that was the cutting-edge technology. So one afternoon, after I had the book deal already negotiated for him, and the future was looking so bright, I get a fax from him, and he says, Mike, I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but I want to terminate our contract. Kind regards, signed his name. I was devastated. So I picked up the phone and called him. He wouldn't return my phone call. I tried for 3 months to get through to him. I was angry at first, deeply wounded. I thought, how could this person, whom I thought I knew so well, and who was so close to me, somebody that I looked up to as a Christian leader, do this to me? And then I went from anger to deep depression. And I told my business partner at the time, I've got to take some time off. I really don't even know what my life's about anymore. I hate Christians. And I really don't want, I'm not sure I want to go on in this business. I was deeply wounded in a way that took me months just to get back to some semblance of normalcy. And that's happened to me many times. Thankfully, not to that extent. I don't know about you, but the deepest wounds that I've ever experienced have been at the hands of other Christians. You know, it's not generally been for me that it's been those that are outside the church that I fear or that can hurt me, but it's those that I call brothers and sisters in Christ. Last year, Thomas Nelson published a book. I love this title, Lord, Deliver Me from Your Followers. A lot of truth in that. And if you're going to work closely with other Christians, and if you're going to work with creatives in particular, and senior pastors and other Christian leaders, it's inevitable that you're going to get wounded. And so what I'd like to really talk about is what I consider to be the number one challenge for Christian creatives. And it's really the number one challenge for Christian leaders. And it really is this: that if you're going to survive and fulfill your God-given calling, you must learn how to handle criticism and overlook offenses. Because, mark my words, this is a tool of the enemy, and he has taken many people out. People that had enormous talent, people that were incredibly creative, and all he had to do was let them get offended and let it fester. And before long, they take themselves out. This happened to me just a couple of weeks ago, as a matter of fact. Thankfully, I think I have some tools now to deal with it. But somebody wrote on a blog post, you can Google this if you want, although I don't recommend it. It's not very edifying, and it's a little embarrassing to me. But the blog post was entitled, Michael Hyatt is a Hypocrite. So I have Google Alerts set to my name, and that came up in my RSS feed one morning. You know, kind of just took my breath away. This same guy's actually said worse in the past. So I took a deep breath and kept moving. But those kinds of things can derail you. And in the past, they have derailed me. And I've obsessed over them and worried about them and wondered what I possibly could have done to offend that person. And you expend an enormous amount of energy, spiritual energy, creative energy that could be used for something else, trying to chase that type of thing down. So what I'd like to share with you this morning is 3 truths we must embrace about offenses. 3 truths that we must embrace about offenses. First one, offenses are inevitable. Offenses are inevitable. I wished it were different, but Jesus himself says, woe to the world because of offenses. For offenses must come, but woe to that man by whom the offense comes. Woe is not a familiar word to us, but if you look it up on dictionary.com, woe means grievous distress, affliction, or trouble. People offend us by the things they do, and sometimes, particularly as creatives, they offend us by the things that they don't do that we think they should have done. Sins of omission, sins of commission. Either way, you and I have daily opportunities to be offended. And by the way, it's not that God gets too busy and so these offenses slip in through the cracks when he's not looking. The inevitability of offenses is because God has a purpose for our life that only those offenses can accomplish. More about that in just a minute. I love this passage in James chapter 1, 2 through 5, and it's talking about trials and temptations in general, but in the Phillips translation it says it this way: when all kinds of trials and temptations crowd into your lives, my brothers, don't resent them as intruders, but welcome them as friends. That is a very countercultural, counter-creative idea, but it's a biblical idea that God intends for our good. The reason that God allows these things in our lives is because he has a purpose. Because God is committed to a bigger story than whatever it is that you're doing at the moment. As precious as your art is, as important as your position or your role are, God is all about your character and about a bigger story that he's weaving. I stumbled onto this quote last week from Daniel Defoe. God will often deliver us in a manner that seems initially to destroy us. Daniel Defoe, in case you don't remember, was the author of the first English novel, Robinson Crusoe. I want to tell you a little bit about Daniel Defoe because it really puts this saying into context. He was born in 1660, and when he was 5 years old, the Great Plague of London began, and within a year, 70,000 people in London died. 1 year later, at the ripe old age of 6, the Great Fire of London hit Defoe's neighborhood hard, leaving only his and 2 other homes standing in the area. At age 7, a Dutch fleet sailed up the Medway via the River Thames and attacked Chatham, his hometown. By the age of 13, his mother died. And oh, was he a Christian creative. He wrote 500 books, pamphlets, and journals. He used over 198 pen names. He spent a short time in prison because he wrote a pamphlet that the government didn't like. At age 43, he was released from prison, and he immediately witnessed the great storm of 1703, which was the only hurricane ever to have made it across the Atlantic Ocean to the British Isles at full strength. Get this, in a week, 8,000 people were killed by that hurricane. In 1719, at age 59, Defoe wrote Robinson Crusoe, arguably the first novel ever written in the English language, and he received unbridled criticism for it. So when he says, God will often deliver us in a manner that seems initially to destroy us, he knows whereof he speaks. Second reason, second truth we must embrace with regard to offenses is that God intends offenses for our good. This is a hard saying, especially when you're on the receiving end of these offenses. But I want you to consider 2 biblical examples. First of all, consider Joseph in the Old Testament. One of my very favorite stories for a lot of reasons. But I keep coming back to it again and again because he's a model of somebody that didn't get lost in the narrative, that understood over time where he fit in the big story and plan of God's economy. You remember he was ridiculed by his brothers, kidnapped and sold into slavery by his brothers. Talk about family abuse. He was later falsely accused of attempting to seduce the wife of a high-ranking Egyptian official. He spent several years in prison, but was eventually, after years, vindicated. He could have been very angry with his brothers. Years later, when he finally meets up with them, he was in a position of tremendous power. He could have had his revenge, but he didn't. They came before him trembling, expecting the worst. And here's what Joseph said: "Do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God?" He knew where he stood. And then he said, "But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive. Now therefore do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones." All of that in Genesis chapter 50. He understood the big picture of God's story and those horrible things that had happened to him at the hands of those he trusted and was the closest to, his very brothers after the flesh. He was able to process that, and at the end of his days, look back and see the hand of God and the wisdom of God to preserve many lives. And that's what God's about in your story and my story. It's not about us. It's about those that he wants to save through us. And sometimes that takes enormous pain in our own lives that we have to go through so that we can be, as Henry Nouwen says, wounded healers. King David, another fabulous story. At one point in his career, he's chased out of Jerusalem by his son Absalom, who had usurped him in a coup. And if that weren't bad enough, there's this character named Shimei who meets him on the road and starts throwing rocks at him and cursing him. I sometimes think that God appoints personal Shimeis in my life. You know, the people that curse me and throw rocks and criticize, and nothing I can do is right for them. So he curses the king and he reminds him of all his sins. And the text says, and by the way, this is in 2 Samuel 16, Shimei says, come out, you bloodthirsty man, you rogue. The Lord has brought upon you all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. And the Lord has delivered the kingdom into the hand of Absalom your son. So now you are caught in your own evil, because you are a bloodthirsty man. Abishai, who's one of David's 30 men, mighty men, says, I love this, "Why should this dead dog curse the Lord the king? Please let me go over and take off his head." Wouldn't you love to have somebody like that on your team sometimes? You know, just take care of that person. Sometimes our Christian ethic gets in the way. You know, we just like to go take those people out. But I want you to notice what David says, how he responds. He says, let him alone and let him curse. For the Lord has ordered him. It may be that the Lord will look on my affliction and that the Lord will repay me with good for his cursing this day. David had sufficient Christian character, sufficient maturity, that he could take something like that and put it into its proper perspective. And see that indeed behind this evil act was a sovereign God who was allowing it for a purpose. It's easy to resent these people because of their offense, but what if God does have a deep and important purpose for sending them? Something that he intends for our good because he truly loves us. Third truth to embrace about offenses is that being offended is a choice. Proverbs 19:11 says that the discretion of a man makes him slow to anger, and his glory is to overlook a transgression. This is one of the things that makes us glorious. It's not about how many Twitter followers you have, or how many people read your blog, or how many people attend your conferences, or what Sunday morning worship attendance is. This is the true glory. One of the ways in which we manifest God in a tangible way in our lives by our ability to overlook an offense. There are times when it's legitimate to get angry. Even Paul says, "Be angry and do not sin, but do not let the sun go down on your wrath." However, the Scripture repeatedly admonishes us to be slow to anger. For example, in James chapter 1, 19 through 20. There are times when it's legitimate to confront other people. I'm not talking about that. There's times when it's legitimate. But there are times when it's better to overlook an offense. You don't have to engage in every offense. You don't have to correct every ill, make every wrong right. Sometimes the best thing to do is to overlook it and just keep going. In fact, this is the example of our Lord. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 21, and this slays me. I remember reading this verse for the first time when I worked for a horrible boss who was mean. I mean, I don't know how else to describe him. He wasn't just aloof, or it wasn't that he just didn't affirm me, but he was mean. And he would often publicly embarrass me. And I remember reading this on one of my lunch breaks when I was in college. And it says this, "For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow his steps." Now get this, "who committed no sin, nor was deceit found in his mouth, who when he was reviled did not open his mouth." Did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but committed himself to him who judges righteously. Let's move to application. I want to just give you some real practical things on what's worked, and believe me, I am still learning this. And when I'm offended, it still stings, and I have to take a deep breath. But it's a choice on how I get to respond. So where the rubber meets the road. When should you overlook an offense? I think first of all, when it's intended as a correction. Brothers and sisters, one of the best things that you and I can do is ask God for the gift of ears so that we can hear the people who love us and who are committed to our good and will say the hard things to us that we need to hear in order to go to the next level. And the Scripture makes this abundantly clear, and we don't have time to go into it, but there's so many verses that talk about, "But he who refuses correction goes astray," Proverbs 10:17. "But he who hates correction is stupid," Romans 12:1. And on and on and on. If we have this resentment towards correction, we'll miss the lesson that God's trying to teach us. So we overlook an offense when it's intended as a correction, and we receive it for our good and for our sanctification. Also, when you discern that the other person was reacting because of something else, it's not always about us. It's not because of something we've done to cause it. It may be of something completely different that caused this to happen. There's a great quote from St. Tikhon of Zdansk, who said, "It is a fearful thing to hate whom God hath loved. To look upon another, his weaknesses, his sins, his faults, his defects, is to look upon one who is suffering. He is suffering from negative passions, from the same sinful human corruption from which you yourself suffer. This is very important. Do not look upon him with judgmental eyes of comparison, noting the sins you assume you'd never commit. Rather, see him as a fellow sufferer, a fellow human being who is in need of the very healing of which you are in need. Help him. Love him, pray for him, do unto him as you would have him do unto you." People sometimes act out of the pain that we didn't cause, but they're lashing out, and we just happen to be in the way at that particular moment. Another time to overlook an offense is when it's undeserved but minor. Another great verse from Ecclesiastes 7:21. It says, "Also, do not take to heart everything people say, lest you hear your servant cursing you. For many times also your own heart has known that even you have cursed others. We've done the same thing ourselves. But you know what? When we say those things about other people, we don't sit there and obsess about it. We say it, we're on to the next thing. And probably the person who's offended you didn't intend it and is on to the next thing. And so often we're wallowing in the hurt of that and in the offense of it. And I think also a fourth time is when no one else is affected but you. Somebody offends my staff, somebody offends my family, I'm liable to speak up. And Jesus talks about that in Matthew 18. But there's a whole realm of offenses that we would be better off just to overlook. How can you overlook an offense? 4 quick ways, and then I'm done. First, acknowledge that you've been offended. There's nothing to be gained by pretending. And you and I have met spiritual people who, when we ask their forgiveness, they say something like, well, I've already forgiven you. You know, like it didn't really hurt them in some kind of super spiritual way. I don't think you can transcend what you don't acknowledge. You can't be healed unless you recognize the hurt. And so I think it's perfectly legitimate to say, ouch, that hurt. When I found that blog post with that horrific title in my RSS feed, that stung. And it would be disingenuous and inauthentic for me to pretend otherwise. Secondly, remind yourself you do have a choice. This is one of the extraordinary things that makes you human. I have a dog named Nelson. By the way, somebody asked me if I named him after the company. Yes, after Thomas Nelson. And they said, why would you name your dog Nelson? And I said, well, I could have named him something else, like one of the other publishing companies, but I like my dog. But my dog, I'll tell you what, if I let him out the back porch and he sees a squirrel, it's instantaneous. He's after the squirrel, or he's after the birds. He's an English setter, and it's just in his constitution. There is absolutely no space between the stimulus and the response, and I'll promise you there's no thinking that goes on in his little head. But you and I are different. In the space between the stimulus and the response is possibility. We can respond in a different way. If you haven't read Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, read it. He's a psychiatrist who is also a Holocaust survivor, who realized when he was in that camp that he really had no control over what his tormentors did to him. But he found freedom in his response because he realized that they could not make him hate them. And to be fully human, to be fully conformed to the image of Christ, is to embrace that and respond in a different way so that even Jesus on the cross, dying a horrific death, could say, Father, forgive them because they don't know what they're doing. It was a choice, and he embraced the choice. I think as Christians, it's helpful to remember that we're just dead to these things. In a sacramental way and in a real way. I had this story on my blog this morning, but I want to just read it to you. It's very short, 3 paragraphs. I love to read the Desert Fathers. Extraordinary wisdom in the form of stories, very compressed, very much capsules. But this is a story about a particular Egyptian monk, Abba Macarius, who was one of the founders of monasticism, also known as Macarius the Great. But here's the story. A brother came to see Abba Macarius the Egyptian and said to him, Abba, give me a word that I may be saved. So the old man said, go to the cemetery and insult the dead. The brother went there, hurled insults and stories at them. Then he returned and told the old man about it. The latter said to him, didn't they say anything to you? He replied, no. The old man said, go back tomorrow and praise them. So the brother went away and praised them, calling them apostles, saints, and blessed people. He returned to the old man and said to them, I have complimented them. And the old man said to him, Did they not answer you? The brother said, No. The old man said to him, You know how you insulted them, and they did not reply, and you praised them, and they did not speak? So you too, if you wish to be saved, must do the same and become a dead man. Like the dead, take no account of either the scorn of others or their praises, and you can be saved. And one of the things to understand when you're reading the Desert Fathers is when they use the word saved, they're using it in a very expansive way that includes our conversion and our sanctification and our glorification. But to be dead, and St. Paul says himself, like the dead, take no account of either the scorn of others. He says, for they died and your life is hid. You died and your life is hidden with Christ in God. That's a reality. Nothing gets to us except what God allows because he has a higher purpose for us in that and can redeem everything. Finally, forgive the other person and let it go. Forgive the other person and let it go. This is literally what the Greek word for forgiveness means. It means to set free, to release, to pardon a prisoner, or to release a debtor. You have that power. Someone once said that resentment is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to get sick. And I think that's true. So to release the other person and to move on. This is a great verse from Colossians, also chapter 3. Therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, put on tender mercies, kindness, humility, meekness, long-suffering, bearing with one another, and forgiving one another. If anyone has a complaint against another, even as Christ forgave you, so you also must do. Let me go back to my original premise in conclusion. If you're going to survive as a Christian creative, as a Christian leader, and fulfill your God-given calling, you must learn how to handle criticism and overlook offenses. If you do this, then your creativity can soar. You're in a place where you're unimpeded by the things that would take you out, by the devices of the enemy that would sabotage your progress. And may God help us all to do this very thing. Thank you.